high-speed rails are being built. You all keep your eyes and your ears open for that. Thank you very much for giving us a call tonight. Let me get caller from area code 314. You're on live with the Black Channel. What's your name? Where you calling from?
This is Dashini from Boston.
Dashini from Boston. What's on your mind?
Hi, Jason. Thank you for this broadcast. As an Asian person, I just want to say I'm a second generation immigrant. My parents are from Sri Lanka, and I see the genocide that's happening. I see the genocide against foundational Black Americans. And there is no Black and Brown coalition. A lot of Asians come to this country and they're anti-Black racists. And so I appreciate your broadcast because I feel like I'm witnessing a genocide. And I know everyone's upset that they think I have fake tears, but I agree with everything that you're saying, and I'm at a point where now I only vote for foundational Black Americans receiving reparations.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Can I ask a couple of questions here? And I want to thank you for giving us a call because it's always nice to know here. About how old are you?
I'm actually 49.
Okay. Well, how long have you been in America?
I was born in the United States.
Okay. Your parents are first generation who came over?
Yes.
Okay. And why did they come here in the first place?
They actually fled a genocide. They actually came from Sri Lanka and they fled a genocide.
Okay, they were fleeing the genocide there. Okay, well, that tells us about the time frame when they came over then. So a lot was happening around that time. Yeah. So when you're dealing with the civil rights movement in America and whatnot, when you're dealing with the 60s and 70s, you got to, like I say, Black folk, whenever you saw us in the streets and whatnot, we were the spear point that was opening up these things for everybody. There was no Sri Lankan, as you know, when you're dealing with Asia, you're dealing with Sri Lanka, you're dealing with Indonesia, Singapore, Burma, Vietnam. You're dealing with a bunch of areas that, there's been wars and conflicts and things, and they're heavily balkanized. You're dealing with heavily ethnic populations, and they kind of just hold on to that. And so you don't have a population like that to speak of on your behalf. There's never been that. So we were the ones who opened the doors for all these various groups in the Middle East, Asia, Southern Asia. We opened the doors for that. They didn't have to have a population to advocate for them. We were their advocates. Even though we were not Sri Lankan, even though we were not Indian, even though we were not Brahmin, even though we were not Korean, we were the advocates for everybody. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that sacrifice has been misused. Folks got over here, and just as soon as they were no longer under the guns of a government, the Khmer Rouge or whatever, next thing you know, they in order to ingratiate themselves with the white power structure, they started taking on anti-Black racism. Now, that's for the ones that didn't have it already before they came. Because what you also notice is even over there, it can be an issue because it runs along color lines. Does that sound about accurate for what you've experienced, that it runs along, skin hue lines?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the caste system in Sri Lanka and India, as you know. And so that is definitely a part of the culture. But it goes deeper. It's definitely, South Asia was also a colony. So you have, it's under white supremacist rule. And so you have that effect of white supremacy. And you bring that, as an immigrant, you bring that to the United States. You have that concept of colonialist rule. And so white supremacy, that experience there's already a culture that's being formed before you come here. And so, but then it's just exacerbated because America is anti-Black racist. And so it just feeds that what's already there. If that makes any sense.
No, let me ask you here about your family, your immediate family.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any of those types of characteristics among them?
Yes, it's there. It's definitely there. And then what happens is once you come here, you assimilate. You assimilate, and then you want to be a part of white culture, white society, and then you just focus on yourself, and then you're not thinking about the whole history of America and the history of how the country was founded on anti-Black racism and the genocide and slavery, and so you don't join that fight. You don't join that fight.
What are some of the things that you've seen in your family? Can you give us like a specific example?
I think what happened, I didn't, so specifically my parents, never, which is kind of shocking, never said anything anti-Black racist. But over time, once they started the media, all of a sudden they start to just repeat things like, oh, well, if only Black Americans worked harder. And they just started, it's something that, it's like, wait, you actually believe that? It's not like they actually had an experience with that. It was just, oh, well, that's what the media keeps perpetuating, the stereotype. Well, that must be true. So then I would basically challenge them and say, wait, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. You don't have any actual experience to back that up.
Okay, when you say they don't have any actual experience to back it up, what exactly do you mean by that?
They don't know anybody that's Black because we kind of grew up in a suburb in Minneapolis, outside of Minneapolis.
There
so
you go. There you go. Now that's what I was waiting for. We grew up in a suburb in Minneapolis, so that means that your family was actually middle class in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay, just like Kamala Harris, these were not poor folks necessarily coming over here, and there's nothing wrong with being middle class. That's perfectly fine. That's great, but like I say, it makes it a whole lot easier to acclimate to the dominant society's view of Black people when you're not coming up like that. So when you're just coming in and just gliding from one middle class to another middle class, and you're completely insulated. That's the crazy part about it is they've adopted these views and never actually came into contact with any Black people on their own. Never actually did that.
Right.
However, if someone were to hold their if I can use the phrase Sri Lankan-ness against them, they would probably recognize that immediately and be like, well, you don't even know any Sri Lankans. You don't even know any. So there's the thing right there. That's why you see it's so heavily programmed. It really, really is. But here's another thing. For those of you who are wondering how the attitude come about here, I've seen it and heard it with my own ears from people in immigration, but particularly from the folks who have been responsible for this, like hiring illegals and whatever. They'll tell them, we want you to come to America because the folks there, the Black folk, are lazy. They don't want to work. So you're actually better than Americans are. You're actually better. So you're doing the country a favor. So if you all want to know where some of that arrogance comes from, it's because the people bringing them are telling them that before they come here. Oh, we need folk like you is what we need. And there's nothing wrong with having a good work ethic. There's nothing wrong with wanting better for your kids. Everybody does. There's nothing wrong with that. The issue that we've had, though, is that over the last century, we were in chattel slavery here. Not in Sri Lanka. We were in chattel slavery here. We didn't have a place to flee to. At least you all, whether it's the Armenians, Sri Lankans, I can go down the list, Cambodians, they had a place to flee to. They could flee and come here. We didn't have a place to flee to. We couldn't get on a boat and go back to Africa or Mexico or anywhere else. We had to stay and stand and fight here. We had to get down and make it work here. We couldn't say, hey, everybody, it's rough in America. Let's flee to Sri Lanka. I'm like, okay, we would have passed y'all's boat on the way going. It's like, okay, where y'all heading? Sri Lanka. Where you going? Louisiana. Really? That's for over a century and a half. So you all had the ability to come to a place where you didn't have to worry about that being held against you because of the work that had been put in for over a century before they arrived. We didn't just build a better world for ourselves and our children. We built a better world for everybody else's. And the first thing that happened was they said, well, hell, let's join together with the folk that y'all stopped and make it more difficult here. And that's the problem. Because ultimately, if they ever get the opportunity to, it's like, by the way, the black folk were just the first ones out. Now we're going to go get everybody else. That's the way it always happens. That's the way it always goes. Everybody thinks they can dance with the devil, and then eventually the devil yanks out the pitchfork at some point and starts poking you in the rump. Eventually that happens. Eventually it does. And when that occurs, they'll be screaming bloody murder. Now you're old enough to remember 9/11. So you had all these Middle Easterners and whatnot, and they were lockstep with white supremacy at the corner stores and things and in Congress. And they were, and of course, in the Middle East, they were lockstep with it till 9/11 happened and the dominant society started going in on Middle Easterners. Then all of a sudden they start yelling for us. And then Donald Trump gets in office. He starts saying, oh, no Muslims in America. And then they come running to us. But in the meantime and in between time, it's a free fire zone on us. Right down to the legislative level. You don't have anywhere in America where black people are ganging up to make legislation against non-black people, even in the places where we should be. You're on the brink of extermination. You should be doing something. We're not lifting a hand to do, for the most part, we're not lifting a hand to do anything. We're certainly not preparing any legislation that targets anybody. We don't even have a vocabulary as a people that allows us to think of legislation that would target another group. If you sat us down and said, here, make a law to target another group, that would take us a few days. Because we don't really have a mindset that says target those people over there. Now we have one that says uplift them, but we don't have one that says target them. Take something from them. Because the first thing we'll say is, well, what did they do to us? We're not used to the idea of somebody targeting you and you didn't do anything to them. They're off in the suburbs of Minneapolis. They've probably been living very fine out there. That's great. That's wonderful. But it becomes a problem when you think that your prosperity has to come at somebody else's expense. Particularly if they're black, it's okay. It's just their place to suffer and do without. And then you wonder why it is you have the George Floyds of the world. Because let me tell you, if that had been a Sri Lankan getting strangled to death in the middle of the damn streets, and by the way, if you want to know what lynching looks like, that's what lynching looks like. Take a look at Eric Garner. Let me ask you here, when's the last time you saw a Sri Lankan get strangled to death by the police? Because I can name George Floyd, Eric Garner, strangled, and there's a couple others. Radio Raheem was based on a real person in New York. If you ever saw Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, Radio Raheem was based on a real person. Actually, truth be told, it was based on a couple of folk. I can name a few people here that have been recorded, by the way. I can name a few who have been recorded. Getting lynched in the street, strangled to death. Strangled. You cannot name a single white person. Many times our population, you can't name a single one strangled to death in front of their family and friends and onlookers. You can't name a one. You can't name a single Asian of any denomination. And don't tell me about criminality. You got the Yakuza, the Chinese gangs. You can't run guns in America. You can't run guns or heroin in America without the Asians signing off on it. You can't do it. Not happening. And yet, nobody's strangling them to death. But I can show you black folk who've been lynched, strangled to death where you can see it. Strangled to death with a group of white folk around them, and I can show it to you. That's the issue. And so we have a fundamental disconnect where humanity is concerned in this regard when it comes to us. It's a fundamental disconnect. And the real shame of it is we worked for over a century to make sure everybody had those abilities. You talk about Chinese people in America. Chinese people didn't have the ability to come to America before us. The Transcontinental Railroad, you have no Transcontinental Railroad if black people did not build the infrastructure necessary to create the economy that could support a Transcontinental Railroad or necessitate one. You don't have it. So before you build the Transcontinental Railroad, what about the previous 2 centuries? That thing didn't just spring up overnight. It was after 2 centuries of work to do that. 2 centuries of ingenuity to do that. And then abolition and fighting against slavery. But remember, the Constitution didn't just do it for black folk. So everybody benefited when we started pushing back against the system. All the slave uprisings and slave revolts and demonstrations and all of the people who were speaking out against white supremacy. There were no Asians to speak against white supremacy in the 1800s or the 1900s. There was none. That was us. And we never begrudged anybody that. You have never seen black people go down to Canal Street, Chinatown, anywhere in America tripping on anybody. You never seen it. Never seen it. It's like, hey, they got theirs down there. Hey, good for them. We don't believe that success for us has to come at somebody else's expense. That's the part that we're dealing with now, is this overwhelming practice that success has to come at our expense. That there's something just fundamentally wrong for folks that we help, by the way. And you know what? I'm going to say this right now in no uncertain terms. You know, if you know, by the way, were your family academicians? Were they academics that had degrees?
No, they weren't.
Okay.
No.
Well, in a lot of cases they do. You know, like Kamala Harris's dad and mom and folks. These were educated people. Barack Obama. These were educated people. So they're aware of the circumstances that made it possible for them to come here. Your parents were aware, hey, by the time they came over here, that was something that America had just opened up. That wasn't something that had just, it's always been like this. No, it wasn't. By the time they came over here, and I'm figuring they came over here around the 60s or 70s.
Yes.
Okay. By the time they came over here, that they were direct beneficiaries of the groundwork that we had laid for the previous century. They were direct beneficiaries, and I'm sure they were aware of American history to an extent, because you need to know if the folks you're going to don't like you. So I don't believe for a moment that your parents were just naive and ignorant about America. They wouldn't have left Sri Lanka on a gamble. They would at least be aware. By the way, do they kill Sri Lankans over there in America? I don't think they would come here without finding out that first. Is, by the way, they're killing us over here. Let me make sure they're not killing us where we want to go. Okay, they're not? Okay, great. That's pretty much the way the process goes. But they undoubtedly would have known about us. And I'm just saying your parents is a metaphor. These folks would undoubtedly know about us. So the crazy thing is they are aware of that. They know that. They come to America, and then instead of them saying, hey, let me give something up to the folks who made it possible for me to be here, it instead turns into an adversarial thing. And yes, they owe us something. They owe us something on account of the fact that we made it possible for them to be here. And not only made it possible previously, we still make it possible today. We make it possible today. It would still be the same situation today. Because let me tell you something. If black folk wanted to join with the right wingers and start targeting other folk, they wouldn't get nothing done. We could just as easy, if it was in our hearts to flip like that, we'd be targeting them like folks target us. We don't do that because we're the swing vote. We can make a whole lot happen in Minneapolis if we just wanted to. If we wanted to gang up on somebody, we're a swing vote. We can make a whole lot happen. We're not trying to do that. But we could. Ask Officer Muhammad Noor. Our silence during his case was what made it possible for him to go to prison for a decade. And he's probably going to wind up walking down most of that sentence. But it made it possible for him to go to prison for a decade because of our silence. Well, guess what? If we had hit the streets, would have been a different outcome. So everybody is still benefiting to this day. Kim Kardashian and the Armenians. The Armenians got the marijuana distribution game sewn up in California. They got that sewn up in California. I've already done a program about that, about the list of marijuana dispensaries in California. And the Armenians outnumber everybody in their applications. Folks can't figure out how the hell it's happening. Which lets you know it's engineered, of course. But you didn't have an Armenian game until we set one up to allow there to be one. Otherwise, they'd be on the outside looking in like everybody else. The Vietnamese who were down there in New Orleans, they couldn't set up shop there if black folk did not allow that. If we had done like white folk did us with Rosewood and Greenwood, Archer and Pine and Wilmington, it'd be a whole different situation if we had done that. And told them, you know what, y'all can go set up shop in the swamp somewhere. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. We don't target their stores. We don't target them from boycotting. We don't target their neighborhoods. We don't target their kids. We don't do any of that. That's the difference. Do you have any children?
No, I don't.
Okay. Well, definitely, I hope that, you spend your time talking to other people about that, because it's one thing to talk to us, and thank you very much for letting us know you're here. That's always good to know there as well. But definitely, these are conversations that need to happen among the Asian community. That really needs to happen. When we say Asian now, we got to include everybody. We used to just think about Orientals, but now we got to include everybody on that, because everybody's playing a part in it. And this is a conversation that really needs to happen at that level. It really needs to happen at that level. Because this idea that we're taking something from anybody, I feel like Chris Rock, if black folk are taking it, where's it going? Because we're sure not getting it.
I completely agree. And when the Stop Asian Hate started that propaganda, which basically is making black people the face of that, I would challenge people with that and say, look, that the hate crimes are committed against black Americans. It's like off the chart. I would point out the facts, and it's just amazing how that propaganda has taken off. And I'm like, Asians aren't the victims. I don't know. I will challenge whenever I have an opportunity. I try to challenge the narrative that Asians are the victims. I know they're not.
Yeah, because they show some things on the news and stuff, but to try to equate that to a systemic oppression that is systemic when nobody is upholding it. You don't see any black folk out here saying, yay, clear the block. You don't see any black folk talking about, yeah, good for them. You don't see any courts upholding it. You don't see anything like that. You don't see anything like what happened with Peter Liang. You never saw any Asian get attacked by a black person and then black folks send hundreds of thousands of dollars for their legal defense. They do. If somebody does something to somebody, we're going to say, hey, let justice be served. We're not going to sit up here and say, hey, let's get together and serve some injustice. That's the difference. I want to thank you very much for giving us a call here tonight. Thank you very much for your insights, and please do give us a call again. Let me get a call from area code 347. You're on.